Welcome to the 78th episode of Rising Tide, the Ocean Podcast. This is David Helvarg and my co-host from the Inland Ocean Coalition, Vicki Nichols-Goldstein.
Hello, everyone.
Today, we're pleased to be speaking with Linda Behnken, Executive Director of the Alaska Longline Fishermen's Association. Linda's fished commercially in Alaska for over 40 years and been at the helm of the association since 1991. Its mission is to promote sustainable fisheries and healthy coastal fishing communities through policy, research, and education. Among her many honors is a National Fisherman's Highline and a 2020 Heinz Foundation Award. Still, threats from industrial and illegal offshore fishing to climate impacts on the ocean to onshore mining and logging keep her work challenging. But before we get into all of that, Linda, why don't you tell us about your own and earliest childhood connections to the sea?
Sure. Well, I grew up on the East Coast, actually. So my first connections were with the Atlantic Ocean. My father loved the ocean, loved sailing, and my mother was a good sport. So we spent quite a bit of time on the water, sailing and exploring tide pools and just learning about the ocean and all that lived in it.
And where was that?
Out of Norwalk, Connecticut.
Cool. So the Connecticut shoreline. And then you eventually ended up a long way from there. What's the brief story of your migration north?
Sure. Yeah. Let's see. Well, I grew up loving wild places, and Alaska is the ultimate wild place. So after my first year and a half of college, I hitchhiked across country and took a 3-day ferry up to Alaska and got off in Sitka and had a vague idea of earning money for college, having adventure, working on a fishing boat. And it took a while to land that first job. There weren't a lot of women working in fisheries then. Still not enough, but there's more than was then. And I just loved it. Hooked, so to speak. Loved working on the water and the fishing community and just how rich and alive the ocean is up here.
Linda, we met, oh my gosh, decades and decades ago. And we went through a master's program at Yale. And I remember you were so clear about wanting to go back to Alaska, working in the fishing industry. And you really wanted to work on best fishing practices, protect habitats, work on policy initiatives. And you have definitely done that. It's pretty remarkable that you stayed the course. So tell us about what you are doing now.
Yeah, I went back to grad school because I wanted to be a more effective advocate for taking care of the ocean and for the small boat fisheries, because those are the people that I have found who have a really deep connection to keeping the oceans healthy. They depend on it for their livelihood, but for most of them, it's more than a livelihood. It's really a way of life that they share with their families, often raise their families in that tradition of the ocean takes care of us. We need to take care of the ocean and pass this on to the next generation. So I took over at Alpha saying the first thing I want to do is get this area closed to trawling, which is, heavy, hard on bottom, generally high impact industrial fishery. And from what I had seen, fishing near trawlers on the open ocean seemed really destructive in this habitat off of Southeast Alaska. And in the first year, or right before I took over running Alpha, there was one trawler that came through and with one tow took enough of a locally important rockfish that it closed down that fishery for the entire year for our local fleet, and also imperiled some other fisheries where those rockfish were occasionally taken as an incidental species. So we dove in and started working to close this area to trawling. It was a 6-year battle, but we eventually got there. So that was, at the time, the biggest trawl closure in the world. Now we have a bigger one in the Aleutians, but that really allowed us then to have an area where small boat fisheries were the priority. And we then started working with our own fleet to improve their best fishing practices. Fishermen are incredible problem solvers, super innovative. You have to be successful on the ocean. And working with them where they would identify a conservation challenge, or managers maybe gave us a challenge that we had to live up to. And we've mapped habitat to help improve their fishing and also minimize impact to a sensitive habitat. We've done bycatch mapping for rockfish species, since they're so long-lived and easy to overfish, to help people avoid those high bycatch areas. We've done a lot of work in improving at-sea monitoring using cameras, videos, electronic monitoring, and a lot of work also to understand how our fleet can be more fuel efficient, reduce our carbon footprint. And now we're actually working on converting the first hybrid fishing boat in the country. Commercial fishing boat. So with an eye towards getting to a zero carbon footprint boat when we can.
Now, people who haven't been to or lived in Alaska sort of lose a sense of the scale. When you talk about having done a trawl closure, we're talking about like 100,000 square miles. I mean, a massive area that you were talking about rockfish. Maybe you could describe that habitat, what was happening to it, and what's happening now in terms of recovery.
The rockfish tend to be associated, particularly when they're juveniles, with a really complex benthic or bottom of the ocean seafloor and there's actually quite an abundance of cold water, deep water corals off of Southeast Alaska, and actually all the way up in the Aleutians. There's another abundance of that. And those corals grow at a millimeter to a centimeter a year. So if heavy nets come through and break things off, knock them over, they're not going to recover in our lifetime. And that's the complex habitat that juvenile fish depend on for cover and hiding when they're small, young, and vulnerable. So just protecting that coral sponge habitat as well as the creatures that live there just seemed incredibly important to me. And now we have that protection. The fishing that happens here is fixed gear, hook and line, or pot gear. That's much lower impact. It's not, mobile, being towed along the bottom.
But I wanted to go back and ask you, you are the ED of the Longline Fishermen's Association. So explain to our listeners what longline fishing is, why it's beneficial, and just give us a little bit more vision about what that fishery looks like.
Sure. So longlining, well, I should say first, so our membership at this point is very diverse. We have fixed gear fishermen, we have crabbers, we have people who engage in salmon fisheries using gillnet, seines, trolls, but longlining is what the association was built around before I took it over. And ALPHA is such a great acronym. We've never changed our name. But so longlining is hook and line gear. Some people now longline with pots for sablefish because sperm whales got so good at taking sablefish off of hooks. But it's where there's hooks along the line. You set it out on the bottom, leave it there for halibut, maybe 4 hours, for sablefish, maybe 12 to 18 hours, and then go back. The line is anchored on the bottom, and there's buoy line with buoys and flags on the surface. So you can go back and find your gear. Of course, we all use GPSs to mark and find our way back to. And then it's hauled back using hydraulics, but the fish are each landed one at a time, stunned when they come aboard, depending on the species. Some are cleaned right there on the boat. They're at least bled, and then they're iced or put in refrigerated seawater and brought into the communities along the coast of Southeast and the Gulf of Alaska for processing. And most of our trips, most people are out for 3 to 5 days for a typical longline halibut or sablefish trip.
So your members just aren't fishing for the halibut.
No, not just for the halibut. In cod we trust.
I knew that was going to come.
But so many target species, also many communities. I mean, you've got real large communities, fishing communities like Sitka and Kodiak. And how much of the population and the economy is tied to fishing?
Well, commercial fishing is Alaska's largest private sector employer, and one of the economic pillars and drivers of the whole state. A salmon is worth more than a barrel of oil. So yeah, we talk about it being a salmon state. It's really, fishing is what drives it up here. And I think the other aspect of Alaska that people who haven't been here miss is that our communities, Sitka's on an island, we're not connected to any other community. We have 14 miles of road in total. These communities are really remote. They're hundreds of miles away from each other, and there is no connection to other communities in most places. There really aren't alternative sources of employment or economic income. So fishing is incredibly important for people's way of life, for their income, and also for food security. So it's that connection to this place. I mean, it goes back, of course. The indigenous communities have relied on this really rich ocean since time immemorial, and stewarded the resources well. And Alaska has picked up that responsibility right in our Constitution. We have a commitment to sustaining fisheries.
Your organization has so many programs, and you're talking about community now and how remote and how you really have to work together. So you guys have put together a fishery conservation network, and tell us about that, because it seems to be a really wonderful way to share information and stay on top of some of the challenges that you guys are dealing with.
That fishery conservation network started with a challenge from fisheries managers to say, this is your allocation of rockfish. You figure out how you're going to live to stay under that allocation. And we got fishermen to share with us their logbook information, and their catch rates of their target species and their rockfish. And we also set them up to be mapping habitat. We then, from that information, could not only flag areas with high bycatch rates for the fishermen themselves to stay away from, but also mentor young fishermen to say, you don't need to make this mistake that someone else has made of going into this area that's concentrates rockfish. Stay out of these areas. They're red, on our map. Those are high bycatch. Don't go in there. But then also take people's individual sets and lay that over the bathymetry, or that seafloor habitat type, so people could see. And we actually mapped by quadrant, so divided the set into fourth. We had their bycatch rates by quadrant laid over from endpoint to endpoint what the seafloor looked like, and they could then see that this part of the set, their bycatch rate was fine, but they went up and over this, pinnacle, and the rockfish bycatch spiked. So next time you set, go around that pinnacle, move your set so you don't run into that habitat. And then we grew from there. Once we had these fishermen who were willing to share data with us and with each other to move ahead the whole fleet with best fishing practices and meet conservation challenges, we started hearing from researchers that wanted to work on a problem maybe they identified, and they wanted a fleet of willing fishermen to be partners in that research. So we've collaborated on a number of different projects looking at ways to understand how, say, these sperm whales were finding boats, what was attracting them, what we could do to minimize that predation and avoid conflicts, and have, a number of other projects that have come up. So we started with science sort of informing what the fishermen are doing. Now fishermen are informing the science back to improve it for everybody. Yeah, so it's been a really successful initiative.
Could you tell us simply what the sperm whales were doing and what's happening now?
Yeah, so sperm whales, I think during the days when the fisheries, well, first off, sperm whales have been hunted, so they were at low levels. And then our longline fisheries were, fishing derbies where the season would open, everybody was out there for a very short amount of time, and then we're done and off the ocean. So the whales hadn't had a chance to learn about how to find a boat and take the fish off hooks. Once we went to a quota share program where people were fishing 9 months of the year, the whales started learning. And we figured out through years of research that what attracts them to the boat is when we're hauling gear, we're shifting in and out of gear all the time to stay right over the line. So you're pulling it up straight and not pulling it across the bottom at all. That's the dinner bell for the whales. When they hear your boat shifting in and out of gear, they know that means you're hauling gear, and they show up. So we tested a number of different deterrents and, certainly didn't find anything that was, the quote magic bullet. The one thing that definitely helps in some situations, we recorded the sound of a boat shifting in and out of gear. When someone's on the grounds, they can set a decoy buoy with a playback device on it that plays into the water column that sound of a boat shifting in and out of gear. And if you set that before you go haul your line, the whales will hang out around that thinking, the fish are going to show up here soon. And you can then run to your set and get a fair bit of your set back before the whales realize something's wrong and they move. That playback device was one of the deterrents we developed that helped. We also have worked with a towed array, something fishermen can pull behind the boat. You can listen where the whales are, and it maps for you where they are relative to your boat. So if the whales are north, you can go set south, just as a way to avoid them, which is really what we found to be most effective. We did a fair bit of satellite tagging to understand, the whales' behavior, where they were headed, and then broadcast that information so fishermen knew what to do to avoid the whales. But ultimately, what's working best for a lot of people is to switch to pots, because the whales are so smart. We figured, we'd stay ahead of them for maybe a year or two, and then they'd be on to us.
I love on your website where you have tips for avoiding whales. And number 2 cracked me up, where it's like, try to fake out the whales. But I mean, that just is another example of how you are really protecting other animals, really trying to protect the larger species and go for the targeted species. So it just made me so happy to see that. And it also cracked me up that you have a sense of humor as you're conveying this information as well out to the public and to the other fishermen.
So you talked about the 24-hour rodeo. One of my books, Rescue Warriors, the U.S. Coast Guard, America's Forgotten Heroes. I remember being out with the Coast Guard in Kodiak in February doing fishing boat inspections. And again, it's a really dangerous profession. And in Alaska, I think, again, people don't understand how large and rough those seas are. And maybe you could talk a little about the safety aspects of commercial fishing in Alaska.
Yeah, sometimes we're fishing 90 miles offshore, for fishing for sablefish. Further off southeast, you can get to the sablefish grounds. The shelf is narrower, so you're closer. But once you get off of Yakutat or more towards Cordova, Kodiak, you're 90 miles out. So when the weather comes up, especially if it's blowing, onto your nose and you're trying to get back in out of it, it can take a really long time. I've fished in seas that were over 20 feet. It's not much fun on a small boat. And, also lost some friends in storms. The derbies were particularly dangerous. The Coast Guard, they are rock stars up here with some of the rescues that they have been able to effect. But there has been a lot of work done with the fleet, with Alaska Marine Safety Education Association, to help with training people to be prepared for when things go wrong, to be quick to get your mayday off, to get in your survival suit, just to know how to respond, to know how to launch the life raft if a helicopter shows up to help, to know how to deal with the cable, to get a pump up and running if they lower you one. All those, it really, in the moment, it's usually horrible weather with screaming winds and a pitching boat. If you don't know how to do those things in your sleep, you're probably not going to figure it out in that moment. So training has been hugely important to improving safety up here in the fisheries.
So are you fishing year-round, seasonally? How do the regulations work with the catch?
I fish seasonally because I'm busy with fisheries management. There are fisheries that are going on year round. Not all of them. Some are have a shorter season depending on what the target is. But there are some fisheries going on in the winter. The Chinook fishery, trawl fishery, hook and line fishery for salmon is ongoing year round, for example.
When I'm thinking about year-round fisheries and all the work that you're doing, both David and I have been wondering, have you noticed any difference with climate change, habitat changes? And can you elaborate on that?
There have been huge changes. Yeah, I mean, the last climate change isn't something that might happen in the future up here. It's happening. The 2016 to 18, we had this huge warm blob of water that sat in the Gulf of Alaska, and we were pulling up these weird pyrosomes, all these different species, and there were huge die-offs. 400,000 common murres washed up on beaches. I mean, it was heartbreaking. Whales stranding. Yeah, it was really rough. The Pacific cod stocks in the Gulf crashed, 80% drop in 2 years. during that time. And in the Bering Sea now, we've seen this complete failure of a number of crab species. And now also this failure also associated with that warm water of the returns of Yukon River chum salmon and Chinook salmon that people used to depend on for commercial fisheries as well as subsistence. And, first the commercial fisheries were closed, and now even subsistence has been prohibited for the last few years. So yes, tremendous impacts, very notable on the ocean, and big impacts on the people as well as everything that lives in the ocean.
You're a policy person, you're an environmentalist, you are a fisherman. From your perspective, what do we really need to do?
Well, we really need to tackle climate change. That's number one. Ocean acidification, climate change, carbon in the atmosphere. Our group has supported a carbon fee and dividend approach as a way to change the market forces out there. We are very supportive of nature-based climate solutions. Maintaining the health of the Tungus National Forest, our salmon forest, and closing the area to trawling, just having an ecosystem that has that resilience built in. That's another big step. And then for us, also working on how we reduce our own carbon footprint. So that's the other initiative we're, prioritizing right now. And then I think in the bigger picture, a lot of it is for conservationists, fishermen to really work together to tackle these challenges and not try to scapegoat one group or another.
Yes, I agree, because we all want the same thing. The fishermen, the environmentalists, the policymakers, we want a healthy ocean habitat. We want clean air, plenty of food, and working together really is the key to making things move forward.
The Biden administration has just taken action on logging in the Tongass and also on the Pebble Mine that has been sort of an ongoing issue. Maybe you could say what's happened with that from a fisherman's perspective.
Oh, those are huge wins. I know we have worked to try and end some of the logging, particularly that was damaging to salmon streams for decades up here. And the decision to reinstate the roadless rule by this administration was just such a huge relief. We were actually part of a lawsuit contesting rolling it back that happened in the last administration. We just were able to, we're in the process of dropping that lawsuit. It's wonderful. And then, of course, for Bristol Bay, there are people who grew up in that region, and for their entire lives, this threat of this giant mine has hung over them and just been this constant, stress. And Bristol Bay is a place where it's the largest wild salmon run in the world. And those fish have been coming on strong despite some of these changes in climate, and been a huge, they are the economic driver for the region. And having that clean water permit that had been issued revoked so that we now can have some confidence that the mine will never be built is just, it's nice to have something big to celebrate.
I wanted to pop in and ask you about the 30 by 30 initiative, where we pretty much the world, the US included, is trying to protect 30% of land and 30% of ocean by 2030. And so how does the fishing community feel about that?
Well, when that initiative was first introduced, it spoke to closing commercial fisheries and other destructive ocean uses. That was when it came out in Congress. And I was really troubled by that because we need to start to recognize there are sustainable fisheries, there are sustainable ways to farm, sustainable ways to ranch, and there are unsustainable ways to do all those things. And clearly we have a lot to learn, particularly from people who have stewarded these resources long before we were here. But if we think we can protect by pushing everybody out 30% of lands and waters and have our planet be okay, particularly in the face of climate change, I think we're fooling ourselves. That really, we need to practice conservation across the whole globe, and we need to start to recognize and follow the lead of those businesses, those communities, those cultures who are doing it right, and to incorporate into our conservation of place and of resources models that work. So regenerative farming, restorative ranching, sustainable fisheries that are supporting local economies, providing food security. Those have to be part of that solution. So I'm really excited. Once the executive order 14008 came out for the America the Beautiful, I'm super excited about what's possible now and really want to see us do more following the principles that laid out to achieve those conservation goals.
And some of the most successful marine protected areas have been mapped out by fishing communities in Port Orford, Oregon, or Vallejos, Puerto Rico, because they know where the nurseries are. They know where things need to be protected. We just recently interviewed a woman who had to leave her whale science to fight salmon farms off of British Columbia. And in Alaska, you never had salmon farms, I guess, because fishermen and women are a powerful political force there.
Yeah, it was clear what they would have done to wild stocks in other parts of the world. And why would you repeat the same mistakes?
Exactly. And David just made a statement, and I wanted to clarify. Linda, are you a fisherman or something else?
I've always been fine with being a fisherman. Some people think it should be a fisher or a fisherwoman. Those labels have never mattered much to me.
Well, I was talking with a fisherman and he said, yeah, I don't like being called a fisher. I go, well, that's an endangered species. He went, oh, well, maybe I do have something in common.
might be a benefit.
Linda, it is coming close to our time together. And I just want to thank you so much for being on the Rising Tide Ocean podcast and for helping the fishermen team up with the environmentalists, with the policymakers. We really need more people like you out there, really understanding the connections and doing great things for the ocean.
Well, right back at you and David.
Rising Tide is a production of Blue Frontier, co-hosted by David Helberg and myself, Vicki Nichols-Goldstein, with support from Natasha Benjamin and Ellie Kurla. Rising Tide's editing services and technical support is provided by Studio Cape May. The theme song is written and performed by Ethan Kenbard. You can find Rising Tide, the Ocean Podcast, at bluefront.org or download it from Apple, Google, Spotify, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts.
Off in the salty ocean, off where the waves roll free, the sparkling water rises, then crashes to the sea. Out amongst the breakers, you'll have no need to fear. It's true, it's the blue frontier. Off in the salty ocean, off to the blue frontier.
Sparky, come here, buddy. Sparky! There you are. Good boy, Sparky.